There are some shiny Pokemon that Game Freak never wanted you to have. I'm not just saying that. There exists a few Pokemon that quite literally were never supposed to be shiny. Game Freak in 2011 decided they would introduce possibly one of the most controversial features ever added to Pokemon, the Shiny Lock. What a Shiny Lock does is that it makes it no matter how many times you encounter or reset or hunt for a Pokemon, it will never be shiny. The first victims of this was Zekrom and Reshiram, and it became a trend pretty much that any Pokemon heavily involved in cutscenes or box legendaries would never be shiny. So the cutscene would be consistent? I don't know, it's kind of a stupid rule. The important part to note is that this locked away many shinies for decades, and there's even quite a few shinies that have still never become huntable to this day. And while the lock in most cases is this completely insurmountable wall, very occasionally there were failures. Instances where players found a loophole around the lock, or in some cases where Game Freak just forgot to apply the lock entirely. These are the shiny Pokemon that should have never existed. First up on this list we have Jirachi, more specifically in the Generation 3 games. Jirachi is a mythical Pokemon which have a history of being notoriously hard Pokemon to obtain as shinies. At this point in time, Jirachi can only be obtained through mystery gift events, where the player is given a specific Jirachi with set IVs and moves. Because the player is just given a Pokemon rather than an encounter, these Jirachis could never be shiny. Except for one. If you pre-ordered the GameCube game Pokemon Colosseum, you were given a disc that allowed you to get a Jirachi in your Pokemon Ruby or Sapphire game. Instead of making the Jirachi the same every time you received it, Game Freak wanted to add some variants. To make your Jirachi a bit more personal, there were actually 65,536 different Jirachis possible from this disc, and as you might have guessed, despite Game Freak's wishes, some of these could be shiny, 9 to be exact. If anyone's done the math already, this actually gives the odds of a shiny to be 1 in 7,281, rather than the standard 8192. This has become one of the most coveted shinies over the years. Needing an unused CD from 2003 is already a ridiculous barrier to entry, and despite the slightly increased odds from 1 in 8192, each encounter can take around 5 to 8 minutes without glitches, making it take almost 800 hours on average to complete. And somehow, the next shiny on this list makes this Pokemon look like a freebie. If you're in the shiny hunting community, you might already know who this is going to be about. Shiny Manaphy. Shiny Manaphy has a lot of notoriety for just how rare it is. First of all, you need a cartridge of Pokemon Ranger, which is an old spin-off Pokemon game that was actually pretty good, I'm not gonna lie. Anyways, you not only need to have this game, but also have a copy that hasn't redeemed the Manaphy egg yet. Not save file, a hard copy. This means that the second you redeem the egg of a cartridge, the cartridge can never produce another egg. You'll need to hunt down another cartridge that also hasn't claimed the egg yet and use that one. Oh, and you also need to beat the entire Pokemon Ranger storyline, which is like 10 hours of gameplay. Once you finally get an egg, you can transfer it to your game and hatch it. If you don't get the 81/92 chance of your egg to be shiny, you have to trade it to a whole nother game and hatch it there, and rinse and repeat until you finally get the 81/92 chance. And when you finally get it, you'll be greeted with a normal Manaphy. Because this was never intended to be shiny hunted, and due to a quirk with how the Manaphy egg interacts with your trainer ID, the Manaphy won't ever appear shiny upon hatching, and instead only in the summary screen afterwards. With these two examples, Game Freak eventually released these two shinies officially, but this next Pokemon is one that not only shouldn't exist, it quite literally doesn't. In 2017, as part of a promotion for the upcoming Pokemon I Choose You movie, Game Freak released 7 special cap variants of Pikachu in the 7th generation. While these cap Pikachus were cool, they didn't have any specific stats, with the only noticeable difference from a normal Pikachu being they held a special Pikachunium Z. 6 of these Pikachus were distributed by a code, and for the final one, a QR code was given, which came alongside a small cutscene. For whatever reason, this last Pikachu had one extra difference apart from the cutscene. It wasn't actually shiny locked. Due to a bug in the game, normally when the Pikachu was given to the player, its personality value, which is basically just a hidden number given to Pikachu, was compared against the ID of the original Pikachu owner, which in this case was Ash. As every Pikachu created from this event had the same owner, there was never any variance in whether it was shiny or not. But for some reason, Partner Cat Pikachu acted differently. Instead of comparing Pikachu's personality value with the original owner's ID, it compared it to the player's ID, which of course was different for different players. This led to Pikachu effectively having no shiny lock. When players finally figured this out and hunted for the Pikachu, however, they met with a shiny that wasn't shiny. Because this Partner Cat Pikachu is a separate model from regular Pikachu, a shiny sprite was never actually designed, despite the fact it can still have the shiny star in its summary. Game Freak has never acknowledged this mistake, or retroactively made a shiny sprite for Pikachu, leaving this to be the only shiny in existence without any sort of sprite whatsoever. But this wouldn't be Game Freak's biggest mistake. Instead of just failing to add a shiny lock like the others, Game Freak actually failed to remove an entire event, leading to one of the biggest chains of discovery in the history of Pokemon. Before I get into this mystery, I'm going to be that boring YouTuber and just ask for a second to subscribe if you haven't already. It lets me know that you actually like this sort of content and whether I should continue with it, and I'm already working on a few extra future scripts. Also, if you have any cool Pokemon topics that you want me to deep dive in and cover, just let me know. In 2009, the final installment of the 4th generation of Pokemon games were released, Pokemon Platinum. During the lifespan of Platinum, special events were introduced into the game as a way to distribute some of the new mythicals, namely Darkrai and Shaman. While these events weren't widely distributed, they were celebrated as some of the best extra content Game Freak has ever given us. While these events of these mythicals were amazing, some people were confused as to why a certain other mythical never had the same treatment. Arceus. In lore, Arceus is the god of all Pokemon, and references to Arceus can be seen as you play through the Sinnoh region, but he never fully appears, or so we thought. Data miners ended up digging around the game and found a weird, unused item called the Azure Flute. This item was completely unobtainable in normal means, but had an event flag connected to it, meaning it was given the same way the items for Darkrai and Shaman items were given in the game. And just like these items, they triggered an event. If you took the Azure Flute to the top of Mount Coronet, an event would trigger. Glass stairs would appear before you, and upon ascending them, the god of Pokemon would be waiting for you at the top. As this was before the introduction of in-game shiny locks, which was in 2011, this Arceus was fully shiny huntable, the same as any other legendary in the game. While this makes shiny Arceus during this time an unintentionally obtainable Pokemon, this is only the start of the discoveries. If you took this specific Arceus out of the Sinnoh games entirely, over to Heart Gold or Soul Silver, and went to the ruins of Alph, a special side quest would trigger. You get a brief interaction with an NPC before being transported to a distant place called the Sinjo Ruins. As the name might suggest, these ruins supposedly exist in between Sinnoh and Johto, and it was one of the first references that these two regions are actually connected. Upon entering the ruins, the player meets the champion of the Sinnoh region, Cynthia, and is asked to choose between the creation trio Palkia, Dialga, and Giratina. After choosing, perhaps the single most confusing and unexplainable cutscene in all of Pokemon happens. Like, I'm not kidding, this was playable on your DS. After the cutscene, the player is left with an egg, and if you didn't guess, inside this egg is the chosen legendary from the ritual. The unique thing about this legendary is that they're level 1, and as you might have guessed, they also had a chance to be shiny. It's important to note that not any Arceus can trigger this event. It's specifically an Arceus that was obtained by the unreleased Azure Flute. There was technically another Arceus that was released in Toys R Us a few months later that also triggered the event, but for a considerable time, this event could only be triggered with an Arceus that never officially existed. Nowadays, Pokemon is much more strict and rigorous with their event distributions and shiny locks, even going so far as to shiny lock the starters in the last 2 main series games. While nothing like these instances will probably ever happen again, these quirks in the history of Pokemon's lifespan are fun to reminisce on, and it makes you wonder what else might be buried undiscovered in the games, waiting for someone to find it.